Hello, everyone, and welcome to Amplifying Voices on Turtle Island, an intersectional caucus. Thank you so much for joining BIPOC Queerness, Identity, Community, and Resistance. My name is Isaac, and I'm a co-founder and board member of Black Lives Matter Sudbury. Before we get started with this panel, we would like to acknowledge that BLM Sudbury is located in Nisquacomoc, later known as Sudbury. This land on which we learn, work, and live is located on the traditional lands of the Atikameksheng Anishinaabe and the Wahnapitae First Nation in the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory. We would also like to recognize the presence and important contributions of Métis peoples in this community and on this land. Here at Black Lives Matter Sudbury, we recognize that reconciliation does not begin and end with a simple land acknowledgement. We must work to actively decolonize spaces and uplift Indigenous ways of learning and knowing. In addition, we all must aid in the ongoing battle for Indigenous sovereignty, access to clean drinking water, and seek justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and two-spirited individuals. Furthermore, we want to acknowledge that February marks Black History Month. While oppression, discrimination, and systemic injustices cannot be diminished to just 1 month a year, it is important to recognize this time as an opportunity to educate yourself, your family, and your friends on the historic contributions of Black communities on Turtle Island. We would also like to take a moment to thank our conference sponsors. It is because of their generosity that we've been able to thrive and present important programming like this caucus within our Northern community. Biographies of our panel participants and a full list of conference sponsors can be found on our website. We are pleased to offer ASL interpretation for each panel, provided by Interpretation Sin-hetero Inc., also known as ISEP. Following this panel, all attendees will receive a feedback survey that can be filled out for a chance to win a prize pack of items, including the caucus logo, designed by Raven Dabowski. This logo expresses the power and connection among marginalized communities across Turtle Island. The art depicts the interconnection between humanity and nature. The woodline stylization and vivid colors aim to celebrate the solidarity among Indigenous and Black communities. Our moderator for this panel is Ruba Grecoere, board member of Black Lives Matter Sudbury. Our panel consists of Akili, Kiana Graham, Ninakasi Okrim, and Debbie Owusu Akia. Welcome everyone, and without further ado, here is your moderator, Ruva.
Welcome everyone, thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited for this conversation on the intersection of being BIPOC and queer. I think it's a very interesting intersection. And I just wanted to also say that I'm coming to you today from the unceded lands of the Algonquin in so-called Ottawa. All right, so if we wanted to get started with everyone, we'll begin with our first question. So I just wanted to put the question out here. What does queerness and being queer mean to you? And what does navigating those experiences mean as a racialized person being BIPOC as well? Okay. So if we wanted to start with Debbie.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ruba, and thank you so much for joining us today. I too am calling from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory in so-called Ottawa. I really like this question because when I think about queerness, I often think about it being political from the forefront, but I also think of it being really, really Black, and I'll explain as to why. When it comes to the political elements of the term, I often think about history, why it was weaponized against LGBTQ people, but then also how did it get reclaimed by us during a time where we were experiencing a health crisis. When I think of the HIV/AIDS crisis and the fact that some really rad queers said we were going to take this word back. We were sick and tired of the forced respectability politics that LGBTQ people felt like they needed to fit, especially with the pressure of like cis-heteros around us. And I love that. I love the fact that we've taken it for ourselves. And I think inherent in it being political is existing outside of the boxes that we're forced to be in, whether it be how we present our gender, how we have sex, how we build community. I think so much of it is political, and that's why queerness for me is that. And when I think about the Blackness element, if you look at our traditional cultures, the way we build family, the way we express ourselves, it's so queer. It has always been so queer. We're obviously using an English term to describe it, but when I think of, the fact that in my tradition, aunties are very much so my mom, just as much as the woman who birthed me. When I think of my cousins as being siblings, and in my tradition, we don't even have a word for cousin. That very element of like shifting that nuclear family on its head is something we've always done. And so really hella Black to me. But when it comes to kind of dealing with the conceptions around race and queerness, very much so I like to center the African element in it and my Africanness, because that's kind of where it's rooted, specifically for me as a Black person who lives in the diaspora here in Turtle Island. Of course, the ongoing legacies of European colonization are things we see all the time. And I think that too comes in when we talk about, the things in our tradition that are really, really queer. Those were the first things that they decided to, or they attempted to kill in order to justify their disposition of our land, of our people. If we think about the transatlantic slave trade, of our resources. And so I think of the legacies of that in hiding those parts of our cultures that are super, super queer, although they still very much so exist. I think of colonial law in our home countries that punish sex between same sex, et cetera, and the fact that we're still dealing with these ongoing legacies. In Ghana, for example, we still have a law that punishes uncarnal knowledge from 1821. And it's that direct law, that influence in our culture, that kind of creates a sentiment back home, but also here, that queerness is something that the Europeans brought to us and not the other way around. And we're constantly, and I even find this as an individual, constantly having to prove to people that we've always been here as Black LGBTQ people, as African LGBTQ people. And doing that can get really exhausting, of trying to prove I am not the only one. But I think the beauty in it, on the flip side, and I'm sure we'll talk about it elsewhere in this conversation, is in finding other queer Africans, I was able to find home. And so, yeah, the biggest misconception for sure is this idea that it's a white thing that came from Europe, not that it's something that's always been a part of who we are, and having to constantly justify that, no, we've always been here and I'm not the only one. And in that process of finding others, I found community and family.
So many amazing points there, and I think community being a big one of them. Akili, did you want to go next?
Okay, so for me, queerness is, I guess my answer kind of ties into both how I navigate through it, but how I visualize queerness. So I see it as me being my truest form and authentic self. And just freely expressing myself of my fluidity, whether that be through my sexuality or my gender identity. But I guess I've always grown up mostly in the North since I was a preteen. So do I always feel comfortable and safe expressing my gender? No, not necessarily, right? And my partner and I are both masculine presenting. And I find in the North, it's sometimes very people stare, or it makes people really uncomfortable or feel threatened and stuff. So I find often I'm suppressing parts of me down and pushing my queerness, I guess, and my true authenticness inside that away. And so I guess finding what Debbie said is finding community and people that see you for who you are and accept you for who you are is really important, because without that, you really don't feel like you can be yourself and stuff, because navigating through regular day, it gets really difficult at times when, people are constantly stopping you. For example, because my partner and I are both masculine presenting, we have people sometimes approach us and literally poke at my partner's chest and be like, oh, I was trying to figure out if you had breasts or not. And that's not okay. Yeah. And we get that a lot. And it's just it's so uncomfortable. So it makes it really hard to feel free to be your truest form, which is what I see queerness as. So it's really hard to I want to be there, but I don't necessarily feel like I'm there yet. Yeah.
Yes, I completely know what you mean. And I think at that intersection with race and queerness too, growing up, I often felt it was pick a struggle. but you don't have to. And I think what Debbie said about, queerness being hella Black is very, very true. That both things really intersect in a way that makes you, especially in the North, like visibly othered in many ways. But yeah, so thank you so much for that, Akili. Kiana.
Hey folks, so being queer means being my most authentic self, because it's interconnected with my Blackness, my transness, and my neurodiversity. And I can't separate those intersections. I can't put myself into boxes. So my queerness is who I am. And some misconceptions I deal with is the fact that some people don't understand how I can be non-binary and be a lesbian at the same time, when traditionally lesbians are like women who are exclusively into other women, but then I have to explain the history of lesbianism and how it's always included gender non-conforming people, and how like the definition could be interpreted in different ways without invalidating other people. So also a misconception that you can't be Black and queer and trans at the same time because it's a white person thing. I know that's been mentioned before, but I just try and relate it back to the fact that that mentality was forced upon us by Europeans. And there were pockets of queer and trans people in all our cultures before that was kind of snuffed out, and we had to like reclaim that. Thank you.
Thank you. That was so well said. I think, yeah, that's something that's really, the idea of not being able to put yourself in boxes, I think is really, really important. Because yeah, as you said, like we can't separate out our identities into kind of discrete pockets. All of those things together are our identities. So moving on to the next question, Intricacies, yes. Okay, sorry, you didn't have a raised hand feature on. I just wanted to make sure. So go ahead. Yes.
I raised my actual hand like they told me to do back in the day in school. I'll remember to push the little hand next time. Yeah, for me, being able to use the words queer, or however I choose to identify on the whole rainbow of unicorns, like, I have that privilege of having the liberation to identify as different things as my spirit is moving and it's becoming more fluid. There are different categories, boxes, and things that I can check off and allow myself to feel safe in. I did mention that it's, to me, it represents a form of privilege. The fact that I live in Canada, in a place where it's accepted for the most part. Legally, it's an acknowledged and recognized thing, and it's written into law. I have the ability to say I am queer, female identifying, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual. I can name off all the things. I can say I am non-monogamous. I can say that I am polyamorous. I can identify on whatever I want to fit the box of whoever I'm speaking with. However, I need to translate into somebody else's mind. There's a word that signifies that. Being a person of mixed descent, so I'm Anishinaabe, I'm Ukrainian and Jamaican. Shout out to all of our Afro kin who are in the Ukraine right now, our queer kin who are out there, sending them all lots of love and all of our relations around. What was I saying? Sorry, I apologize. I'm so sorry. Oh, with me being 3 different descents, I get to code switch a lot, because what queerness or indigiqueer or two-spirit, because I do identify as two-spirit, I get to place myself in a totally different way of life, a totally different culture, and it has a different context and understanding depending which circle or which lodge I'm sitting at within my indigenous cultures. When I come to the Afro diaspora, there are ways in which that I can represent as a proud Black identifying person, understanding culture-wise from a Caribbean descent, how it is something that is highly shunned due to slavery and colonization, assimilation. I bask in privilege in being able to walk freely as a Canadian citizen globally and feel somewhat protected. There are some rights that protect me. being a female identified person versus a male identified person, or a trans person, or any of those that fit into that portion of our community who cannot be open, those who are not even allowed to think it out loud, let alone speak it out loud. So like I bask in privilege, and I try to do my best to honor all of those who are not. And it's also very spiritual as well. Like when we label it with colonial language, and we erase that and look back at our innate spiritualism, our innate weights of life, what is rooted within us naturally. That's why we're such awesome people to begin with. It's rooted, like we didn't lose that magic or that stardust within our own beings. And it did take, some other folks who tried to like erase that from us, but what we know is rooted deep in us, it just stays, just like how our skin and all these things. So for me, I guess just with queerness and along what that means, it's a lot of liberation, and I'm honored to walk with that.
Thank you, Intricacies. Yeah, I think that the root of this intercession is really liberation. And that's something that I always think about when it comes to queerness for me. Okay, so moving on, I wanted to talk about the fact that queer and trans folks of color continue to be disproportionately affected by homophobia, transphobia, and hate crimes and violence, but also within the queer community itself. BIPOC folks experience a disproportionate amount of violence. How do you think we can collectively make spaces safer for queer and trans folks of color? Okay, I'll go ahead, Intricacies. I saw your hand.
I think one of the first things that we can do is really look inward and understand what are some of the things that we're perpetuating or recreating to not have those safe spaces. I think we have a general idea and understanding through lived experience, like what a lot of the negative parts of that is and how to navigate through. But I think because of the way society is set up and medias and all the contributing factors, we tend to forget our own contribution and how we are continuing those same things. I think that's the first thing that we need to do before we can even really look anywhere outwards.
Yeah, so I think that's so important to remember the sometimes like the racism or the queerphobia or transphobia that are already within the systems that we're working with, and that if we're not actively dismantling those, then we're also contributing to them. Thank you so much.
Sorry, if I can just add into that.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Like, no, don't be sorry. We're both doing our thing. Like if we also like look within our community, our umbrella community, there's so much of it within our own communities. And if we even take a little step further and we do the pockets of nationality, race, culture, or little groups and cliques, there's so many ways when you sit with folks that you're comfortable with, we talk a certain way, we act and we do. We know this, that code switching thing. So like even within our own community and being able to call in those that are closest to us, like, hey, like actually that's just not cool anymore. It's that part of that self-check as well within our community.
Thank you. That's really important. Yeah, sorry. All right, go ahead, Debbie.
Yeah, love what Intricacies mentioned with regards to like looking inward. And I'm going to speak obviously from the context of being a Black queer African, because that's the lived experience I have. When I think about, broadly speaking, as people who have intersecting identities that are impacted by multiple forms of oppression, we're more vulnerable to particular violences. And I think the flip side for queer folks, when we try to create queer spaces for us, those are supposed to be places of refuge. But I think there's layers and nuance to it. For me as a Black person who, was just coming into myself and my queerness in my early 20s, mainstream queer spaces or, non-mainstream, you code the language however you want, those were the first places I went to navigate who I am, build community. But I think what I was first confronted, and I think what this question immediately addresses, is like how we're also othered within mainstream spaces to begin with. And I don't know if other people resonate, I remember so many questions about, or things like, oh, it must have been so hard for you to come out to your family. And other like microaggressions like that, because of this assumption that Black people, or Africans in particular, are more homophobic and transphobic than others. And I think it's important for me to emphasize the more than. And I think the part that frustrates me the most of navigating that, and I'm at a club, I'm trying to enjoy, I'm trying to dance, I'm trying to shake my ass, you know what I mean? So like, why are these things coming up? I think what happens is there's a lack of nuance around understanding how homophobia and transphobia manifest in our communities. And I think we understand that the most. We do that deconstructing. We have those conversations amongst ourselves. But I think what's important for non-Black folks, white people in particular, to understand is that it's not unique to our communities, homophobia and transphobia. It's not. And I think a lot of it has to do with the centering of whiteness and white experiences in like public understandings of queer and trans identities, and also in the making of certain spaces. And what it does is that it forces many of us to associate moving away from heteronormativity and moving away from gender binaries as a white thing, which I think that's a theme that's come up already, but that only furthers anti-Blackness in ourselves, internalized anti-Blackness, and that should not be a thing. And so I think what's important when we're building these spaces is how do we essentially divest or decenter from whiteness so that when Black folks are entering these spaces, we are allowed to be all of ourselves and to love all of the many things that make us who we are, our Blackness, our queerness, our transness, etc. I think when we do this thing of propagating certain identities as being more progressive than others, it forces us to hide again. And I remember so many people being like, I can't do this anymore because I'm feeling like I'm forced by other queer people to pick one over the other. And I think too, what's important is on the flip side is creating more Black queer spaces. And I've seen some of the beauty of it here in Ottawa. There's a group called Dark and Fruity that has kind of created an event in the summer during our Pride so that we could have a for us, by us space to celebrate all that is Black queer identity. I think of Blockorama in Toronto, which is one of my favorite things to go to because I get to see so many Black queer and trans people. And I never feel like I'm being interrogated as a Black queer person to tell a trauma story without the nuance of how homophobia and transphobia were introduced to our communities, et cetera. But I think what's important too, as well, if we're gonna make these spaces safe for folks, is recognizing that like Black, queer, and trans people have always been at the forefront of our movements. We've been huge leaders. We've been people to teach direction when it comes to our global fight for liberation. And if you are looking to build those spaces more so that they're safe for Black people, if there's trust, speak to us. But I think most importantly, pay us for that too. I think that's the end part, is like, pay us for that knowledge because we have it. So seek it out.
Yes, say that. But I think what you also mentioned about understanding like nuance within even the homophobia we experience within our communities, of our BIPOC communities, is important, because it's a lot easier, to speak to other BIPOC people about homophobia and transphobia, because it's important to talk about it in our communities, but it's very difficult to speak about it outside of their communities, because there is an understanding that, especially, like I'm also coming from an African context, that's like, oh, like that is like a homophobic culture. And when they don't understand like why that is in there, it's very hard to actually communicate outside of that why. So I think that's really important. Thank you for bringing that up. Kiana?
Yeah, so I think there needs to be more education on like anti-racism, anti-oppression, intersectionality, like all those baselines in like queer spaces, especially like programs that are specific for like 2S LGBTQ youth, because I feel like start young essentially about putting those practices into place. And there needs to be representation in these queer and trans spaces by staff and volunteers that are BIPOC, because nothing's worse than going to like a space and then everyone is white and there's no one like you, and then you become tokenistic. And then like Debbie was mentioning, it's like people like thinking that your struggle is worse than theirs because of the color of your skin. So it's really frustrating in that aspect. But also, I also want to go back to the point where, like, make spaces for racialized queer and trans folks. Like, we don't, and that might seem like divisive, but like, I don't think it is, because we deserve to have spaces where we can just have fun and not have to talk about all the trauma we go through. Maybe I just want to party. Like, I love Blockorama for that reason, because I can just meet other people. They have great community organizations who give out resources like Black Cap, which is, do I spell that out? Sorry. CAP, Black CAP. So yeah, I just want to go to a space where I can be myself and not have to worry about explaining my existence to white people.
Absolutely. So well said. Thank you. Akili?
I guess I'm kind of echoing off of like what everyone else is saying, but for sure, definitely queer, BIPOC voices need to be prioritized more in the queer community, because often, yes, we focus on like the white queer experience, and that makes it very hard for us when it's like, well, we don't relate to that necessarily, or that's not our experience, or if you're trans, you are like this, but that's not our lived experience, right? So like Keanu was saying, sometimes I find, in specific just Black queer groups to be more safe, and you can just enjoy yourself. You're not necessarily talking about all these things or feel like you have to stick up for yourself and educate people because what they're saying is problematic. It's like, oh, this is a safe space for us to just like be. And I find that like even in social media, sometimes like those are good places to be if you can't have that like physically, especially like in the North, there's not like a whole ton going on. But I find sometimes, like Kiana was saying, like it is important for us to have just places just for us.
All right, yes, thank you so much. I think that's so important. And kind of jumping off of that question, how is living into like these intersections, have you found like liberation in that, specifically at the intersection of being BIPOC and queer, and how do you think things like joy and community come into that? Because I think I found so much liberation at the base of really existing as a Black queer person, and finding like community and joy, I think has brought me to liberation almost forcefully, because you can't operate under, like imperialistic kind of like colonialist, white supremacist, homophobic, transphobic, you can't like operate under those systems when you've really chosen to be BIPOC and queer, especially once you find community, because you have to do things differently, because your whole kind of, your life and how you relate to people works differently. So I found it has kind of almost forced me, but in a good way, into a place of liberation. Sorry, this is a question that's not on the list, so I'll say it again and then I'll type it so that people have time to read it. But how do you feel living into these intersections has helped you find liberation in terms of community and joy? Go ahead, Akili.
Like you said, it's kind of exciting because all these expectations that I guess society puts on you throughout, whether like depending, I guess, when you like knew your queerness, but all these expectations that were put out on you, you kind of release because, hey, I already know that I don't fit in, but like now it's even, more freeing, and I'm just gonna live in my like authenticity and know that the world doesn't necessarily accept who we are, but there's communities that do, and I don't live to please the other ones that aren't necessarily for us, right? Because you find the joy and acceptance with like others that I don't know, it's a word that I'm looking for, but like, you know, the others that are like with the same, like, oh, the system was not made for this. And finding, hold on, I'm blanking on the, the word that I'm looking for right now, but I'll come back to you.
All right, that's great so far though. Perfect. Debbie, yes.
Yeah, I think this is a beautiful question. In my own like work, in my own activism, I try to center Black joy as much as possible, just because it's a great way for us to kind of take away this idea of like trauma being placed on Blackness and Black people, and to create something for our own on our own terms about what brings us happiness. And so I love that. But with regards to this question, when I think about like fully immersing myself in the intersections, I often think about how I even like came into, again, my own self as a queer person, and Black feminist theory was what gave me the language to explain what I was going through. And through that process, I found other Black queer, Black lesbian theorists. And it's like through that work, it kind of inspired, I guess, what is the like foundation for my like pathway to liberation. And in finding community and finding myself, you know, I found what I was really fighting for, and that was like choice. Oftentimes when we talk about like, what is liberation, what is freedom? And when I say freedom, I mean it in this context, not the truckers down the street from my house context. Freedom for me is about choice, the choice to express ourselves the way that we want to, the choice to, again, build family and connection the way we want to. And I think immersing myself in those intersections, I was able to find myself and express myself differently. I was able to find community and build family the way I wanted to. And so those things have brought me joy, and it came through recognizing that, yes, there are real impacts to my life as someone with multiple forms of identities because of intersecting forms of oppression, but there's also beauty in the fact that those intersections come and meet and collide and tell a beautiful story. And I think we're doing that in our own unique ways. And we do that in the way that we all collectively fight for liberation. And so for me, the fact that I found choice in all of that to do and express myself the way I can, I think is the like real beauty and the real joy of it all.
That's so beautiful and so well said. Thank you. Did anybody else have thoughts on this question for the next one? Okay. Oh, sorry. I just saw someone raise their hand. Okay, go ahead, Kiana.
Yeah, it might be short, but I felt like I just became more confident in who I am once I realized I was trans-masc and I got top surgery. Like I realized I was non-binary. I realized I was a lesbian. I just felt like I came into myself in a way that I didn't feel like had the confidence before. Like I think back to like how I was in high school and how like uncomfortable I was in prison, in like what's the word? Performing, there we go, performing femininity in a way that like I didn't feel comfortable for me, but I felt like, oh, well, I'm a Black girl, so I have to do all these things to fit in as a Black girl in high school. And once I let go of all of that, like that's what liberation means to me, is when I just felt like I became myself and who I should be.
All right, and then Nikasi.
Yeah, as I'm listening to what has been said, like I wholeheartedly second all of that and support and like raise all of that. But for me, what I recognize in me being light-skinned and passing for an exotic person, as I get told very often, it provides me the opportunity to sit at many tables and to really understand the language that is being spoken out against our community members, our kin, our family, our ways of life. I'm able to sit like a fly on the wall and hear all these things and then project what's necessary in a way that folks can really truthfully understand that need to have that overstanding, not the understanding, but the overstanding, the full spectrum of it. For me, it's it's having a lot of privilege in knowing that I come, and I mentioned that before, that I come from a place and space where everything is acceptable, even my wildest imaginations and kinks, all of those things are all acceptable. Meanwhile, there are folks out there, like I had mentioned earlier, that can't even think it out loud. So knowing that I have the capacity to rub elbows, networking is my game. I love a networking. And somehow, some way, I'm able to smile and say and do and become a chameleon in all the places and spaces and do amazing sneak attacks on bombarding with information, necessary information, making people listen to me. Like, I grew up in the foster care system. So what that means for me, legally, I had the ability to understand that I had rights, regardless of who was trying to throw rights or no rights at me. I knew what they were, what my privileges were in that, where the silver spoons were granted to me, the fact that I can advocate at a young age and knowing the law and the system and all those things. And then to be able to take that information and just throw it right back at those folks. Like, I have that amazing ability. I know that I'm able to captivate and pull people in to listen through all my amazing abilities, those strengths, that resiliency that's been put in me. I know that I often have to take many for the team. I know that I have to take a lot of brunt work because there are many folks, and it was mentioned earlier about skin tone, because I'm light skinned, I have more opportunity and privilege to say what is necessary. And my kin next to me on his panel have even mentioned that it would be even harder for them. I feel it's my responsibility to support and uplift, step back when absolutely necessary, and support those who need to be lifted before me. Like, I recognize those things and making those things mandatory, non-negotiable by taking the brunt. Like, I honor that.
That's so beautifully said, Intricacies. And I think, yeah, when we find those spaces where we have privilege to, you know, like, as we get that like courage from our community, but also like the spaces where we have privilege to use that and to educate, like you said, the sneak attack. Because yeah, like, I come from a background of, you know, like religiousness and Christianity, and I was very entrenched in that. And there's this comedian, Guy Branum, he's Jewish, and he talked about how he decided not to leave his religion when he came out because people would listen to him, right? Because it was like, like, if he left, then they didn't have to deal with him. But when you're there in that space as a person existing with, you know, whatever identities are counter to that space, then they have to deal with you, which can be exhausting. But I think also when you have the energy for it, it can be a really beautiful thing, because then they can't, you know, they can't let you go. You have to be listened to. So I think, yeah, demanding that space when you can have it is really, really beautiful thing. Thank you so much. All right. Hey, so we also wanted to talk about in terms of accessible resources. So we often find resources such as healthcare, mental health, social and financial supports. There's a lack of adequate accessibility for those resources, especially for BIPOC and BIPOC queer individuals. What changes do we think need to occur in order for us to better support and uplift those who are unfairly affected by these, whether those changes be, you know, community-wise or, you know, policy-wise, whatever kind of channels you think, but what channels do you think we need to make those resources adequate and accessible? Okay. Debbie, sorry, I didn't know.
No worries. So I'll contextualize it that I am going to be speaking from a policy perspective only because that is my everyday experience. But before I do delve into that, I want to acknowledge that, like, the fight at the community level is the very reason why we have some policy changes for the better for TS LGBTQ people. Oftentimes governments forget that, and they often think it's a top-down approach. No, it's community, it's activists. Nonprofits are probably at the third, if any, and I'm speaking as an executive director of one, and that's how, like, change happens. And so I'm speaking from this perspective as someone who has to play a connecting role between community and decision makers. But to answer the question, the fact that there is inaccessibility and accessing these resources for BIPOC people or Black people in particular, these are policy failures. It's a failure of those who make legislation, decide what funding goes around. They have created policy in a very narrow lens, and it forgets those of us who exist at the margins. And so for me, and I spoke about this recently at a different panel, if we're going to talk about kind of bettering access to this, we're going to need, and I'm going to, again, bias, for Black LGBTQ people, there needs to be specific Black LGBTQ responses at the policy level to increase our access to resources from a health perspective, social, financial, etc. There is a hesitancy to name Blackness out loud at the policy level and this is no shade because we've been using the term BIPOC this whole panel, in including everyone, like saying BIPOC and not necessarily speaking specific to Blackness. All the issues under the umbrella are considered one, although we know through our own communities that anti-Blackness creates very specific challenges to us. And so as a result of it, we see it when it comes to accessing resources. And so in terms of solutions, and I'll keep it really, really short, I want policy decision makers to stop being afraid to say Black and to stop being afraid to have policy interventions that are specific to Black LGBTQ people. There's a national action plan on LGBTQ2 that's about to come out. And although there were some very innovative approaches to wanting it to be for us, by us, or nothing about us without us, there is still a gap on the Black community engagement on an LGBTQ policy initiative. And so for me, I don't know if they're here or if this is something that other people can continue to bring into their own communities. Don't be afraid to say Black, because that's how we are able to get access to things, especially as LGBTQ people. Fund Black LGBTQ initiatives. There are Black community-led organizations that don't get the same amount of funding as our other counterparts, and especially within the LGBTQ sector. And so from my perspective, I think say it loud, say it proud, we need Black things and Black funding, and that's the way that I think we can build the capacity for adequate access to all these resources.
Thank you. Yeah, as a person also working in policy, I definitely agree that that is very much an issue of them being afraid to, even when they say target groups is a fun one to use there instead. But yes, definitely, I think at a policy level, those things don't need to be done. Intricacies, sorry, is your hand still up from before or was it not? I couldn't tell. Oh, okay.
Thank you. Appreciate you. Yeah, so hands down, the addressing of anti-Blackness, period. Like there's no other thing to say on top of that. Like that runs in everything. Anti-Blackness is a lead reason why our Black or Afro-diasporic community members don't get access to anything, is because of that. And even within our own Black communities, there's still that oppression behavior that's there when it comes to shadeism, when it comes to the Canadian term of blood quantum or first generation Canadian, or like there's all these barriers. Anti-Blackness needs to be addressed within our own community and outside our community. But I also want to wholeheartedly stress the fact that we need to acknowledge, understand, acknowledge, and support the work that is already being done by other Black members or Afro-Indigenous or Afro members of our community. We don't need to recreate the wheel. Our communities are already full of geniuses and change makers and move makers and ground pavers. And we need to support that work. We need to figure out what is our role. What am I capable of doing in supporting versus me trying to jump on hey, I think I can do that too. Now, what am I capable of doing and how can I support in that way? Is it that I just have an ear? Is it that sometimes I create a safe space for Black folks to come in? Is it that I'm working on a grant that provides opportunity for support for people? To me, amplifying what's already there and knowing your role and how you can support that is 100% important. And I think that also we as Black identifying folks, Black community, visibly noted Black community members. We need to really work on our encouragement of our fellow community members. Like, we need to be confident, not just in ourselves, but confident that we can love our kin, our blood relations. Like, we need to be able to address like those little microaggressions that we give to our own community members. Like, there's a lot of like femme on femme aggression of eyeing and like, oh my God, this person. Nah, can we say, Queen, you're beautiful? Can we say, sis, you're amazing? Can we say, sir, I'm so proud of you? Can we uplift each other? Can we do that? Can we get to a point where we're not relying on non-Black individuals uplifting and praising and giving us credit for things that we already know we're credible for? Like, I feel like if we can build ourselves in that way, which is hard because it's been oppressed and ingrained into us, that we are lesser than, and we think and believe and we walk in those ways. Not all of us, but those who have the capability and the ability right now that are feeling most within themselves to help and support for our other fellow community members to be met where their spirit is at and to support them in going through those things. If we know that we have an opportunity, are we sharing that with 5 other people we know at no charge, no cost, because we know we're building community, or respectively saying, hey, I've done this work and I want you to join on with me. Like, what I know, I should be teaching 5 other people. For each skill or each knowledge or thing that I have, I'm supposed to be passing it on, because that ensures the economy, the way of life, the way that we act as a unit, whether it's in North American West Coast universal blue views, or on an international level of what that looks like for us. And it really does dissect down to how we perceive ourselves. Here in North America, we say Black and white, but meanwhile, everywhere else in the world, they address where they're from and who their roots are. But we know that people in North America are not fully rooted. So we have alternatives, and we try to work with those alternatives. Are we reclaiming things, or are we just like, are we reclaiming things that people have taken away from us? Are we able to piece together with what knowledge we have? Are we able to combine all of what we know, the bits and pieces, and make them into a bigger picture to show that we don't need other people all along? And when we need to use and abuse whatever advantages are there for us, like, can we do that? Yep, I lost my train of thought, but I think that's enough.
No, that was absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much. And I think especially what you said about what's already being done is so important, because especially, you know, at a policy level, at a nonprofit level, people try to do things, but like those things are already being done at a community level. What we need to be doing is funding them, making sure they're getting the funding to keep that stuff going, because yeah, people are doing amazing things in this community. And I'd like to recognize the people here as well for the amazing things that they do. So I was going to move on to a couple of questions from the Q&A as well, if we wanted to address some of those. So one of them is, can you speak to the commodification of pride or rainbow washing by corporations and its harm to the queer community? And I think this is especially to the BIPOC queer community, because what I've noticed is as more banks move into pride, you know, BIPOC folks, like especially trans queer folks, like are more and more often pushed out of pride as, you know, the center, which is ironic because these are the people who have led. And I think also a depoliticization. So I'll add to the question, not just a commodification and a rainbow washing, but also a depoliticization of pride. If anybody wanted to speak to that.
I'm just formulating my thoughts. Give me 1 second.
Oh, absolutely. No, go ahead. Time to think. Go ahead, Debbie.
Yeah, I can start the conversation. So I guess it's like my own personal thoughts on it. So for me, I work a lot with education and the work that I do, and then even in my own community work. And I think history is a great teacher and provider of context. We've seen this before with other movements. We've seen how feminist movements have been co-opted by businesses and then depoliticized and kind of derooted from the like historical political source of what it was striving to do. And then we're seeing the same thing with pride. I think where for our community, where it gets a little, there's more of like a more visceral response, at least there is for me. It's because of that history of pride to begin with, and how quickly the increase in the like corporatization of pride equals a decrease in people's remembering of why we are here to begin with. And through that, and you mentioned it, we see the erasure of like Black and Brown stories from the beginning, recognizing that Black and Brown people, in particular, Black and Brown trans women and trans femmes, were at the forefront of kind of pushing for what we have today. And so people need to know that Pride was a police riot. Like when we talk about the Stonewall riots, that was a police riot. So when we're talking about state violence, when we're talking about the irony, in my opinion, where something was addressing state violence to now is something that can be marketed to LGBTQ people, we have a problem. Where it becomes even further complicated is we're talking about marketing, right? We're talking about business, we're talking about selling things to LGBTQ people, because apparently we all got money to spend. Who in our communities are they actually targeting? Majority of us who are LGBTQ, especially our youth, are dealing with houselessness. We are dealing with like financial precarity. We're dealing with job insecurity. The pandemic exacerbated all of this. When these corporate businesses come to Pride, they're not talking to people like us in this panel. They're talking about white cis gay men who have the most money in our communities. And so that's how that like pushing to the margins happens, and that depoliticization happens. And so for me, I am the person who's going to be like, yeah, we're gonna acknowledge the history of this, but that doesn't mean we're going to take away the parts of the joy and the celebration. I said it before, I want to be able to shake my ass at Pride with other Black people, but that comes on top of recognizing the contributions our ancestors had in this movement and what we're currently doing to continue that fight for liberation. And so that's how I see it.
Nah, yeah, I think, yeah, it's like if you're not throwing a brick at a cop, it's not Pride. I do think the understanding state violence is a big part of it. And I think we do miss out on a big part of what Pride is about when we don't talk about state violence. So thank you for pointing that out. Yes, Nanikasi?
Thank you so much for that. So one of the things that I think about commonly is that Black folks are amazing, hands down, and the way that we do things, the world takes from it, and the world glorifies what they've taken. If we remove ourselves from these things, they don't have anything. If we create and make our own spaces, which we have been doing, and it shows that we're more than capable of doing that, and we have better results when we work with our own, for us, by us, FUBU, if you want to put it at that. I think that it's really important that we remove ourselves from Pride, because that's not what our Pride is about. It's not where it originated from. It's no longer serving us. It's kind of like, when you throw a party and you have party crashers come in, and then you just make sure that you change the location of the party and it's by secret invite only. But it doesn't have to be a secret invite. It could be with good hearts invites. We don't need to be at Pride and have our one little dega floats at our one little dega spots and in a blocko. That's what we have here in Toronto. Like, we don't need to work with anyone. We can work within our own selves. And so if we have funders helping us, how are we keeping funders accountable? Because we all know that people like to meet a Black quota, especially around Black History Month. Everybody wants to meet a Black quota. So all these people that say they want to help and support Black bodies, and especially within our own community, how are we keeping them accountable? So how have you been supporting us? Because we don't want to jump on last minute, because we're not an afterthought. We've been here, original peoples, whatever. How are you helping us now? And how do you plan on helping us in the future? What is that strategic plan? What are your experiences and privileges in knowing how you're supposed to support us as a community? I think that if we understand that we never needed anyone to jump on our wagon, and we don't need people to continuously make us feel as though that they can seize what we have started, what we're done, and what we're doing. You can't copy that. And it's not authentic. And when you're walking around and just seeing, I'm just going to say it, lots of white folks with hairy body parts and no clothes on, walking up and down in pride and feeling their liberty and their freedom is at the expense of our people, Black and brown bodies who started this. We can definitely teach, we can definitely demonstrate. We can't always teach everyone everything, but we can demonstrate what our standard is, what we will tolerate and what we won't tolerate. And what we will tolerate is how our community members are finding themselves home, but we're not going to tolerate is people crashing on that ability for our people to find their way home. Yeah, that's what I have for now.
So beautifully said. Thank you. Did anybody else want to jump on that question before I went to the next one? Okay. All right. So the next question comes from a mom, and they have a 15-year-old non-binary queer Black kid who they want to support in the best ways, but they understand that that experience is their experience of sexuality, gender, and race is already in some ways so different than theirs when they were young. For context, they're 40. And honestly, I feel like even at my age, a person who's 15 is having a different experience than what I had because things are changing so quickly. But anything you would want to share for our Black, queer, and trans youth? I'm looking especially at the youthful ones for this one, but everyone, go ahead. Because I think it's really important to get that perspective. Oh, okay, Nakasi, go ahead.
I am so proud of you, and I love you, and I see you, and I feel you, and I hear you. It makes me so proud to know that you have a parent that acknowledges you, because so much of us don't come from that. And it's not that many of our family members or our kin don't want to acknowledge us, they don't know how. So mom, like hands down, I'm a mom as well. I have a 21-year-old daughter who also is magnificently rainbow. Does no labels thing, and love is love. Like, if it's not harming yourself or anyone else, what does it matter? Are you living in a good way? Mom, just keep showing them love. Keep being a safe space for them to come and to talk to or to be around. It's not about you. It's always about them. And young one, like, you're so amazing. I'm certain that those that are living now and are knowing that you are feeling a form of confidence within yourself. So many of us couldn't do that. And to see you living in that in such a young age, like, that's really beautiful. And just allow yourself to explore the journey of what this means for you with no restriction. Your supports are your supports, and it doesn't always have to be family. There's so many people here that love you and see you and feel you. So mom to mom and to the young one.
Thank you so much. Kiana, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm 25. I didn't realize I was trans until I was about 20, so it's a little later on in life. But for me, I think that what would have been most helpful from my parent was to be more accepting that things are changing for me, and what I might be identifying as might change, but like to take me seriously in that moment, because for me in that moment it's important. And also just having that open space to like talk about like queer drama, like non-binary drama. Like when you're 15, everything is so serious. Like I think back to like what I was like really upset about when I was like 18 in my last year of high school, and none of it matters anymore. But like it's fine, because just be that person they can come to talk about those things, because in that moment it really is important to them. And also just do your own research. I tried explaining things a million times and it wasn't clicking, but I had a whole bunch of resources on standby where people are just talking about what it means to be non-binary, but also explaining for them to explain what being non-binary means to them, and might be different from what the definition is. So yeah, just giving space for them.
Yes, I think that's so important because I think that's one of the big changes that has come like over time and kind of in a cyclical way is how people identify and the nuances that are involved in it. So even when someone takes up a label, I think it's really important to get to the root of what it means for them because yeah, there's so many nuances even within people who like identify as non-binary. Thank you so much, Kiana. Akili, go ahead.
Okay, first of all, I'm loving that youth have this vocabulary. I remember growing up, like when I look back, it's very obvious I was queer, but I didn't necessarily have the vocabulary to know that about myself or even research it. And now we have like the internet to kind of give us that. And I think like finding, even if you don't have it physically, finding your community online and also like finding people that are similar to them for them to communicate with and feel accepted and like you're not alone in it, I guess, and with similar experiences too, right? To know like, hey, sometimes I'm like, is this my actual gender identity? And then you come back and you're like, okay, yeah, that's who I am and stuff. And sometimes it changes, right? Yeah, I'm almost 30 and it took me quite a bit of time to realize that I was non-binary and I definitely didn't have the vocabulary and I have 2 children. And I remember like being pregnant and just confused of the feelings of like how pregnancy relates to femininity necessarily and stuff, but that doesn't make you feminine or whatnot, right? And just like be free to express yourself because there's gender roles and standards that are placed upon you, but that doesn't change who you are, your non-binary identity, regardless of whether you want to display a certain way or not.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think you said it perfectly, especially with changing. I think especially as a non-youth, I would say, I don't know if I can identify as a youth anymore, but allowing things to change even within the way you identify, as, whether that's a change in label or just how you define it. Because I think so often once you find a label, you're so happy to have found something that fits you. But also like as human beings, we move through life pretty fluidly. Things change, our opinions or just how we nuance ourselves changes. So I think giving yourself and them permission to change, whether if it's how that they identify or just how they nuance it, because I think that really helps feeling that you're able to change however however you feel that day really helps you to be able to fully express yourself and not feel like you have to put yourself in a box because you've chosen a label. But thank you so much, everyone. I appreciated your energy, gave me absolute life. I want to keep connecting with everyone on this panel because it was absolutely amazing, so life-giving. Genuinely, all your opinions were so beautiful and well said. And I really love this idea of the way we build community like this, that we're able to get together and have these talks, and talk about the lacks that, the areas that are issues, but also the joy. Because like, y'all bring me so much joy. I absolutely love the BIPOC queer vibes. And I think it brings so much to how we liberate ourselves and how we express ourselves when we're able to speak from our truth. And I'm all about that light and liberation, honey. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Ruva. I just wanted to say shout out to all of our panelists and moderators. Thank you so much for cultivating such an insightful discussion. You are also amazing, and this energy from this call, it's radiating. So I'm just really happy that I was able to be here today. As a reminder, keep an eye open for our follow-up survey and an opportunity to be entered for a chance to win a prize pack of items, which include the caucus logo designed by Raven Dabowski. After a brief break, we will be back with Identité de l'identité, la réalité d'être francophone et noir at 1:30 p.m. And for folks who do not speak French, we will have someone in the Zoom chat who will be writing translations for people to follow along, so I'd still recommend you come through. And for intersectional caucus information, please consult our website and social media. And last but not least, I want to thank our sponsors for this wonderful event, Cambrian College, Canadian Mental Health Association, Centre de Santé Communautaire de Grand Sudbury, Le Centre Victoria pour Femmes, Coalition to End Violence Against Women, Collège Barrières, Future North, Galerie de Nouvelle Ontario, Greater Sudbury Public Library, Mental Health and Addictions Program of Health Sciences North, the Nickel Refillery, Public Health Sudbury Districts, Réseau Access Network, Sudbury Action Center for Youth, Sudbury Workers Education and Advocacy Center, and last but not least, the YWCA Sudbury. In the spirit of the conference theme, amplifying voices on Turtle Island, stay loud, stay proud, our voices will be heard. Thank you so much for joining us today and have a splendid rest of the day.